a Bengal tigress that killed more than 400 people across Nepal and northern India during the early years of the 20th century. Her reign of terror lasted 8 years and forever changed the lives of thousands of villagers who lived in constant fear of her presence. This hunt is remembered not only for its scale of human tragedy, but also for the methodical pursuit that finally ended it, conducted by Jim Corbett in the Himalayan foothills of Kumaon. The story stands as one of the most documented cases of man-eating behavior in recorded history, and a testament to how a single predator could bring entire regions to their knees. The year was 1903 when the first reports reached the administrative offices in Kathmandu. A tigress had taken a woman from the village of Rupal in the far western districts of Nepal. The incident seemed ordinary enough by the standards of the time. Tigers were common in the dense forests that covered the lower slopes of the Himalayas, and occasional conflicts with humans were part of life in these remote settlements. But this tigress was different from the beginning. Within 3 weeks of the first killing, she had claimed 7 more victims. The pattern was unlike anything the local hunters had seen before. Most man-eating cats killed when desperate, usually during times of injury or old age when normal prey became too difficult to catch. This tigress showed no signs of desperation. She was methodical, returning again and again to the same area, hunting humans with the same precision she might have once used on sambar deer. The villages of western Nepal in 1903 were small clusters of stone and timber houses perched on hillsides carved into terraced fields. Rhododendron forests stretched up the mountainsides above them, giving way to pine and oak at higher elevations. Below, in the valleys, thick sal forests provided cover for wildlife that had lived alongside humans for centuries. The people were mostly hill farmers, growing rice, maize, and millet on terraces their ancestors had built generations before. Life moved with the seasons. During the monsoon months of June through September, families worked the flooded paddies, transplanting rice seedlings in the ankle-deep water. In winter, they harvested crops and prepared for the dry months ahead. Women walked forest paths each day to collect fodder for livestock and firewood for cooking. Men herded goats and cattle to grazing areas in clearings carved from the jungle. Children played near streams that tumbled down from glacial peaks invisible in the distance. The tigress changed all of this within her first month of killing. Women who had walked alone for years now moved only in groups. Children were kept close to houses during daylight hours and forbidden from venturing outside after sunset. The normal rhythms of agricultural life became secondary to the simple need for survival. Her hunting pattern revealed an intelligence that disturbed even experienced trackers. She avoided the times and places where men carried weapons. Instead, she struck when people were most vulnerable. Women collecting water from streams in early morning, children playing near the edges of villages, elderly people moving slowly along familiar paths they had walked for decades. She seemed to understand human routines better than the humans themselves understood hers. The local administrators sent word to Kathmandu requesting assistance. The response was typical of colonial bureaucracy. Forms were filed, reports were written, committees met to discuss the situation. Meanwhile, the death toll continued to climb. By December of 1903, the tigress had killed 37 people in western Nepal. Villages that had existed for centuries began to empty as families fled to larger towns where safety might be found in numbers. Fields went unharvested. Livestock wandered unattended through forests, where their bleating calls served as dinner bells for other predators who moved into territory the tigress had made her own. The winter of 1903 brought heavy snows to the high country, but the killings continued in the lower valleys where people had retreated. The tigress followed them down, adapting her hunting range to match human movement patterns. This behavior convinced local hunters that they were dealing with something beyond their experience. Several attempts were made to organize hunting parties. The first group consisted of 12 men from 3 villages, armed with old muskets and led by a tracker who had successfully killed 2 leopards in previous years. They followed her tracks for 3 days through rhododendron forests, where the undergrowth grew so thick that visibility extended barely 10 feet in any direction. On the morning of the 4th day, they found her tracks leading into a ravine, where a small stream cut through granite boulders. The tracker moved ahead to scout the terrain, while the others waited at the ravine mouth. They heard his scream echoing off the rock walls before they heard the tigress. By the time they reached him, she was gone, leaving behind only paw prints in the sand beside the stream and blood on the rocks where the tracker had tried to climb to safety. His body was never recovered, despite 3 days of searching. After that, volunteer hunting parties became rare. The Nepalese government eventually sent a company of soldiers to the region in February 1904. They were equipped with modern rifles and accompanied by 2 British officers experienced in hunting dangerous game. The expedition lasted 6 weeks and covered more than 200 square miles of forest and farmland. They found numerous tiger tracks, many of which belonged to the man-eater, but never managed to bring her within rifle range. The closest they came was during their 5th, when sentries reported seeing a large tigress watching their camp from a ridgeline approximately 200 yards away. She remained visible for nearly 10 minutes, apparently studying their movements and equipment. When they attempted to approach her position, she vanished into terrain so rough that following her tracks became impossible. The expedition returned to Kathmandu with recommendations for relocating entire villages to more defensible positions and establishing a permanent military presence in the affected region. Neither recommendation was implemented due to cost and logistical concerns. Instead, the government issued bounty notices offering substantial rewards for the tigress's death and encouraging experienced hunters from other regions to try their luck. By spring of 1904, the man-eater had killed 63 people in Nepal. Her territory now covered an area roughly 30 miles long and 15 miles wide, encompassing 8 villages and dozens of smaller settlements. The psychological impact extended far beyond the actual killing zone. Reports of tiger sightings, some real and others imagined, came from regions hundreds of miles away where tigers had not been seen for years. The effect on local wildlife was equally dramatic. Other predators began moving into areas the tigress had abandoned after depleting human prey. Leopards, normally cautious around tigers, grew bolder in their absence. Wild boar populations exploded in fields that were no longer being farmed. Sambar deer and other ungulates began grazing closer to villages, apparently sensing that human activity had decreased. But the most significant change was in the tigress herself. Witnesses who managed to see her from a distance reported that she was larger than any tiger they had known, with a coat that seemed unusually dark for a Bengal tiger. Her movements suggested confidence bordering on arrogance. She no longer bothered to avoid human settlements completely, sometimes resting during daylight hours within sight of houses whose inhabitants could only watch helplessly from behind locked doors. In June 1904, she made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. Perhaps driven by depleted prey in her established territory, or simply following some instinct that pointed her toward new hunting grounds, the Champawat Tigress crossed the border from Nepal into the Kumaon region of northern India. The first killing on Indian soil occurred in the village of Champawat on the 15th of June, 1904. A young woman had left her house before dawn to milk the family buffalo in a shed behind the main building. Her husband found her body an hour later, dragged barely 50 yards from where the attack had occurred. The tigress had fed on her victim before abandoning the kill, behavior that suggested she was completely unafraid of human retaliation. Champawat sat in a valley where the Sharda River wound through hills covered in mixed oak and pine grew on the higher slopes, while sal and shisham dominated the valley floor. The village itself consisted of perhaps 40 houses arranged around a central square, where a small temple dedicated to Durga provided spiritual focus for the community. Terraced fields climbed the hillsides in neat rows, supporting crops of rice and vegetables that fed about 200 people. The British colonial administration in the Kumaon region was more organized than its Nepalese counterpart, but equally unprepared for what was about to unfold. District officers filed reports with their superiors in Nainital and Dehradun. Police investigators documented evidence at killing sites with the same methodical approach they used for ordinary crimes. Forest officials consulted records to determine when a tiger had last caused significant problems in the area. None of these efforts anticipated the speed with which the situation would deteriorate. Within 2 weeks of her arrival in India, the tigress had killed 6 more people in 3 different villages. Her hunting range in Kumaon expanded to cover an area even larger than her territory in Nepal, stretching from Champawat in the east to Tanakpur in the west, and from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the plains of Uttar Pradesh in the south. The colonial government's first response was to organize a hunt using local officials and volunteer sportsmen from the hill stations where British families spent the hot season. 8 hunters participated, including 2 cavalry officers on leave from their regiments and a tea planter from Darjeeling who claimed extensive experience with dangerous game. They established a base camp near Champawat and began systematic searches of the surrounding forest. The hunt lasted 3 weeks and covered territory that would have challenged even experienced tiger hunters under normal circumstances. The forests of Kumaon in 1904 were dense and difficult, with thick undergrowth that limited visibility and steep terrain that made silent movement nearly impossible. Streams and ravines cut through the landscape in patterns that created countless hiding places where a tiger could remain concealed until prey came within striking distance. The hunting party found abundant evidence of the tigress's presence: paw prints in mud beside water sources, claw marks on trees where she had sharpened her claws or marked territory, kill sites where she had fed on wild animals, proving that she continued hunting normal prey even while pursuing humans. But like the military expedition in Nepal, they never managed to bring her within shooting range. Their closest encounter came during the second week, when trackers following fresh prints led the party into a ravine where recent rain had turned the ground into treacherous mud. The lead tracker, a local man named Budj Singh, who had worked as a guide for hunters throughout the region, discovered signs that the tigress had been resting in thick cover less than an hour before their arrival. As the hunters positioned themselves for a systematic search of the area, Budj Singh noticed movement in dense undergrowth approximately 50 yards ahead. He whispered warnings to the others and raised his rifle, but before anyone could determine what he had seen, the forest erupted in chaos. The tigress burst from cover and disappeared into terrain so thick that following her became impossible within seconds. Later examination of the site revealed that she had been watching them for an extended period before deciding to leave. Her tracks showed that she had circled their position at least twice, apparently studying their movements and equipment before choosing her escape route. This behavior convinced the hunting party that they were dealing with an animal whose intelligence exceeded anything in their previous experience. The failed hunt had consequences beyond the simple matter of an uncaught tiger. Word of the tigress's ability to evade trained hunters spread quickly through the hill villages, confirming local suspicions that supernatural forces were involved. Stories began circulating about villagers who had seen her eyes glowing in darkness where no tiger eyes should have been visible. Others reported that she cast no shadow even in bright sunlight, or that birds and other animals fell silent in her presence in ways that suggested unnatural power. These stories might have been dismissed as rural superstition under ordinary circumstances, but the reality of her hunting success made rational explanation difficult even for educated observers. By autumn of 1904, she had killed 28 people in India while avoiding every attempt to track or trap her. The numbers alone were unprecedented, but equally disturbing was the apparent ease with which she continued to evade capture. The British authorities tried different approaches. Professional hunters were brought in from other regions where man-eating tigers had been successfully dealt with in the past. Rewards were increased to levels that should have attracted every competent tracker in northern India. New hunting techniques were attempted, including the use of drugged bait and mechanical traps imported from England. None of these efforts produced results. The professional hunters returned to their home regions with stories of an animal that seemed to anticipate their every move. The increased rewards attracted inexperienced bounty hunters whose incompetence sometimes endangered the very people they claimed to be protecting. The mechanical traps were either avoided completely or triggered by other animals that wandered into territory the tigress had temporarily abandoned. Meanwhile, life in the affected villages continued its steady deterioration. Schools closed because children could not safely travel to classes. Markets that had operated for generations were abandoned when farmers became afraid to transport goods along forest roads. Religious festivals that had marked the seasonal calendar for centuries were canceled because large gatherings presented too tempting a target for the tigress. The economic impact extended far beyond the immediate hunting zone. Trade routes that connected hill villages with plains markets were disrupted when merchants refused to risk travel through areas where the tigress might be hunting. Agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned fields that were too isolated to work safely. Livestock prices collapsed when herders could no longer access traditional grazing areas. But perhaps the most profound change was in the daily rhythm of village life itself. For centuries, people in these hills had moved according to patterns established by farming seasons and religious calendars. They had walked forest paths at all hours, worked alone in distant fields, and gathered in large groups for festivals and celebrations. The tigress changed these patterns completely. Movement became a matter of careful calculation. People traveled only when necessary, and then only in groups large enough to provide some measure of protection. Women who had traditionally collected water and firewood in early morning hours now waited until later in the day when more people were awake and moving about. Men working in fields carried weapons and maintained constant watch for signs of danger. Children's lives were especially affected. Play areas that had once extended throughout villages and into nearby forests were now restricted to small areas within sight of multiple adults. Games that had been played for generations were abandoned if they required children to spread out or make noise that might attract unwanted attention. Traditional stories and songs were replaced by new warnings about the dangers that lurked in familiar places. As winter approached in 1904, the tigress had established a hunting pattern that covered an area of nearly 800 square miles. Her territory included portions of 4 districts and affected the lives of an estimated 50,000 people. She had killed 91 people in India, bringing her total death count to more than 150. The colonial government faced increasing pressure to resolve the situation before it spread to other regions or inspired copycat behavior in other tigers. Official reports filed with the government of India in Delhi acknowledged that conventional hunting methods had failed and that new approaches would be necessary. The stage was being set for a different kind of pursuit, one that would require patience, skill, and understanding of tiger behavior that exceeded anything previously attempted in the region. By the beginning of 1905, the rational explanations for the tigress's behavior had given way to beliefs that reflected older traditions of how humans understood their relationship with the natural world. In villages throughout Kumaon, people began to speak of the man-eater not simply as a dangerous animal, but as a manifestation of divine anger or supernatural power that could not be defeated by ordinary means. The transformation in local beliefs followed patterns that had deep roots in hill culture. Tigers had always occupied a special place in the religious imagination of these communities. They were associated with Durga, the goddess who represented divine feminine power in its most protective and destructive forms. Images in local temples showed Durga riding a tiger into battle against demons that threatened cosmic order. The association between tigers and divine power was not merely symbolic, but reflected a lived understanding of how dangerous forces in the natural world connected to spiritual realities that governed human destiny. The Champawat Tigress seemed to embody these connections in ways that made rational analysis impossible. Her hunting success exceeded anything that could be explained by ordinary animal behavior. Her ability to evade capture suggested knowledge that transcended normal tiger intelligence. Most disturbing of all, her apparent preference for human prey indicated a relationship with human communities that resembled divine punishment more than natural predation. Stories began to circulate that connected her appearance to specific violations of traditional practices that maintained harmony between human and natural worlds. Some villagers recalled that the first killings had occurred shortly after a dispute over forest use that had resulted in the cutting of trees sacred to local deities. Others pointed to changes in religious observances that had weakened protective rituals traditionally performed during hunting seasons. These explanations gained credibility as evidence accumulated that the tigress's behavior differed from normal tiger patterns in fundamental ways. Experienced hunters noted that she seemed to avoid areas where traditional protective rituals were still being performed. Forest guards reported that she appeared more frequently in villages where modernization had disrupted traditional practices than in communities that maintained older ways of relating to the natural world. The most influential of these stories involved a holy man named Jagdish Pant, who lived in a small hermitage near Champawat. Pant had spent years studying traditional texts that described relationships between humans and animals in terms of cosmic principles that governed all life. He claimed that the tigress represented a test of spiritual understanding that could not be resolved through violence, but only through recognition of underlying causes that had brought her into conflict with human communities. According to Pant's interpretation, the man-eater was not simply a dangerous animal, but a messenger whose presence indicated that traditional balances between human and natural worlds had been disturbed. Her killings were warnings that could only be properly understood by people who maintained connections to older forms of knowledge about how spiritual and material realities intersected in daily life. This interpretation found ready acceptance among villagers who had watched modern hunting methods fail repeatedly. If British rifles and military organization could not stop the tigress, perhaps the problem required different kinds of understanding and different kinds of solutions. Traditional protective rituals that had been neglected during years of colonial administration were revived with new urgency. Offerings were made at forest shrines that had been abandoned as superstitious practices incompatible with modern education. The revival of traditional practices created conflicts with colonial authorities who viewed them as backward superstitions that interfered with rational approaches to wildlife management. District officers complained that villagers were wasting time and resources on religious ceremonies instead of cooperating with organized hunting efforts. Forest officials argued that traditional beliefs about sacred groves and protected animals created unnecessary restrictions on methods that might actually succeed in killing the tigress. But these conflicts only strengthened local conviction that supernatural explanations were more reliable than modern ones. Each failed hunting expedition provided additional evidence that conventional approaches were inadequate. Each new killing demonstrated that the tigress possessed abilities that exceeded normal animal capabilities. The growing death toll became proof that only supernatural intervention could resolve a situation that had clearly moved beyond the realm of ordinary wildlife management. By spring of 1905, the tigress had become a central figure in religious discussions throughout the hill districts. Priests debated whether her presence represented divine punishment for specific sins or a more general test of spiritual understanding. Villagers made pilgrimages to temples where special prayers were offered for protection against her attacks. New religious festivals were organized around rituals designed to appease whatever forces had sent her to terrorize human communities. The transformation in local religious practices was matched by changes in daily behavior that reflected supernatural rather than rational understanding of the danger she represented. People began to avoid certain times of day that were considered especially dangerous, according to traditional beliefs about when malevolent spirits were most active. Specific routes through the forest were abandoned not because of evidence that the tigress used them, but because they passed through areas associated with supernatural power. Protective amulets and charms became common items in markets that had previously sold only practical goods needed for farming and household activities. Traditional healers who specialized in dealing with supernatural threats found themselves in greater demand than medical practitioners trained in modern techniques. Religious ceremonies that had been performed only occasionally were now conducted regularly as communities sought every possible form of protection against an enemy that seemed to exist beyond the normal boundaries of the natural world. The economic impact of these changes was substantial. Resources that might have been used for practical defensive measures were diverted to religious activities that had no direct relationship to tiger behavior. Time that could have been spent on organized resistance was consumed by rituals that addressed spiritual rather than physical threats. Traditional leaders whose authority was based on religious knowledge gained influence at the expense of educated officials who understood modern hunting techniques. Yet from the perspective of villagers whose lives had been disrupted by a year of constant fear, supernatural explanations offered something that rational analysis could not provide. Hope that the situation might eventually be resolved through means that lay within their own cultural traditions. Modern hunting methods had failed repeatedly. Military intervention had produced no results. Government promises of protection had proven worthless. Traditional approaches might at least offer the possibility of influencing forces that seemed to control their destiny. The tigress herself seemed to respond to these changes in ways that reinforced supernatural interpretations of her behavior. Witnesses reported that she appeared more frequently in areas where traditional protective rituals had been abandoned and avoided places where they were being actively performed. Her hunting patterns seemed to follow rhythms that corresponded more closely to religious calendars than to natural cycles that governed normal tiger behavior. These observations encouraged further development of supernatural explanations for her presence and activities. Local scholars began to research historical precedents for animals that had served as instruments of divine will. Traditional stories were re-examined for clues about how previous generations had dealt with similar manifestations of supernatural power. Regional variations in religious practice were compared to determine which approaches might be most effective in resolving the current crisis. The most detailed of these investigations was conducted by a group of Brahmin priests from Almora who spent several months interviewing elderly villagers about their memories of similar events in the past. Their research revealed numerous stories about animals that had been sent by various deities to punish specific violations of religious law or to test the spiritual understanding of entire communities. According to these historical accounts, such manifestations typically continued until underlying spiritual problems were identified and corrected through appropriate religious responses. The animals themselves were not considered evil, but rather instruments of divine justice that would return to normal behavior once their purpose had been fulfilled. The key to resolving such situations lay not in destroying the animals, but in understanding and addressing the spiritual imbalances that had brought them into conflict with human communities. This interpretation provided a framework for understanding the tigress's behavior that made sense of aspects that remained inexplicable from purely rational perspectives. Her intelligence, her hunting success, her ability to evade capture, and her apparent preference for human prey all became comprehensible as manifestations of supernatural rather than natural powers. By autumn of 1905, these supernatural explanations had become dominant in local discourse about the man-eater. Villages throughout the region had organized religious responses based on traditional understanding of how spiritual and material worlds intersected in daily life. The tigress was no longer discussed primarily as a dangerous animal to be hunted and killed, but as a spiritual challenge requiring religious rather than military solutions. This transformation in local understanding would prove to be crucial when a different kind of hunter finally arrived in the region. Someone who combined modern tracking skills with deep respect for traditional knowledge about relationships between humans and the natural world. Someone who understood that killing the tigress would require not just accurate shooting, but recognition that her behavior reflected patterns that could only be comprehended through patient study of how she had adapted to the particular conditions of her chosen territory. The winter of 1905 brought a new level of fear to the villages under the tigress's influence. Her hunting had become more frequent and more daring, with attacks occurring even during daylight hours when people had previously felt relatively safe. The psychological toll of living under constant threat had begun to manifest in ways that affected every aspect of community life. Sleep became irregular and troubled throughout the affected region. Families who had once slept soundly behind unlocked doors now barricaded themselves inside houses each evening, listening for sounds that might indicate the presence of the man-eater. Children woke frequently during the night, crying from dreams filled with images of the tigress that dominated their waking thoughts as well. Adults suffered from exhaustion that made daily work more difficult and more dangerous. The normal rhythms of village life had been completely disrupted. Markets that had operated for generations were now held only when military escorts could be arranged. And even then, attendance was sparse, as people weighed the need for goods against the risk of travel. Religious festivals that had provided social cohesion for centuries were canceled or drastically reduced in scope as communities became unwilling to gather in large numbers that might attract the tigress's attention. Women bore a disproportionate burden of the changes forced by the man-eater's presence. Traditional responsibilities that had required them to work alone or in small groups were now impossible to fulfill safely. Collecting water from distant sources became a communal activity that consumed time and resources previously used for other tasks. Gathering firewood and fodder required armed escorts that were not always available when needed. The impact on children was particularly severe. Schools had closed throughout the region, leaving an entire generation without formal education during crucial developmental years. Traditional games and activities that had prepared children for adult responsibilities were abandoned if they required movement away from immediate adult supervision. The natural curiosity and exploration that characterized childhood was replaced by constant awareness of danger that shaped their understanding of the world in fundamental ways. Agricultural work suffered as farmers became unable to tend fields that were isolated or required overnight stays away from village centers. Crops were planted later and harvested earlier than optimal timing would have dictated, reducing yields that were already stressed by labor shortages caused when workers fled the region. Livestock management became extremely difficult, as traditional grazing areas were abandoned due to the risk of encountering the tigress. The economic consequences extended far beyond the immediate hunting zone. Trade relationships that had developed over generations were disrupted when merchants refused to travel routes that passed through areas where the man-eater was known to operate. Craft production declined as artisans lost access to materials that came from forest sources now considered too dangerous to exploit. Traditional systems of exchange that had bound hill communities together began to break down under the pressure of isolation and fear. Local government structures proved inadequate to address the scale of disruption caused by a single animal. Village councils that had managed community affairs for centuries found themselves dealing with problems for which their traditional methods offered no solution. District officials trained in routine administrative procedures were overwhelmed by the need to coordinate responses to a crisis that affected every aspect of life in their jurisdictions. The breakdown of normal social structures created opportunities for various forms of exploitation and abuse. Merchants who were willing to risk travel to affected areas charged exorbitant prices for basic goods that had previously been readily available. Traditional moneylenders increased interest rates on loans to farmers whose reduced income made repayment more difficult. Some officials used the crisis to justify increased taxes and fees that added to the economic burden already being borne by frightened communities. Religious responses to the situation became more elaborate and more expensive, as people sought spiritual protection against a threat that seemed beyond human capability to address. Traditional ceremonies that had once been simple affairs involving mainly family members expanded into elaborate community events that consumed resources desperately needed for practical defensive measures. The cost of special offerings and ritual materials placed additional strain on household budgets already stressed by reduced income and increased expenses. Medical problems increased as the stress of constant fear combined with disrupted nutrition and inadequate rest to weaken immune systems throughout the affected population. Traditional healers reported higher than normal rates of anxiety-related disorders, digestive problems, and sleep disturbances. Pregnant women suffered complications at increased rates, and infant mortality rose in villages where normal patterns of prenatal care had been disrupted by restrictions on movement. The tigress seemed to sense the growing fear and vulnerability of the human population in her territory. Her attacks became more frequent during the winter months, and witnesses reported that she appeared increasingly bold in her approach to human settlements. Tracks were found within yards of houses where families lay awake, listening for any sound that might indicate her presence. Livestock were taken from pens that had been constructed specifically to provide protection from predators. Stories circulated throughout the region about near encounters that demonstrated the man-eater's growing confidence around human habitation. A woman in Kaldhungi reported seeing the tigress walking calmly through her village in broad daylight, apparently unconcerned by the presence of people who watched helplessly from behind closed doors. A farmer near Champawat claimed that the tigress had followed him along a forest path for nearly a mile, staying just out of sight, but making her presence known through occasional glimpses and the sound of her footsteps in dry leaves. These encounters reinforced the supernatural interpretations of the tigress's behavior that had become prevalent throughout the affected communities. Her apparent lack of fear suggested power that transcended normal animal limitations. Her intelligence in avoiding traps and hunters indicated knowledge that exceeded anything that could be explained by natural learning processes. Her selective targeting of vulnerable individuals demonstrated understanding of human behavior that seemed impossible for an ordinary predator. The psychological impact of these perceptions was perhaps more damaging than the actual killings themselves. While the tigress had killed more than 100 people by early 1906, she had terrified thousands more who lived in constant expectation that they might be next. The fear affected decision-making in ways that created additional dangers beyond the direct threat posed by the man-eater herself. People made choices based on fear rather than rational assessment of actual risk. Families abandoned homes and fields that represented generations of investment because rumors suggested that the tigress had been seen in their area. Traditional knowledge about forest safety was discarded in favor of superstitious practices that had no relationship to actual tiger behavior. Resources were devoted to protective measures that had no practical value instead of being used for solutions that might have provided real security. The cumulative effect of these changes was the gradual breakdown of social and economic systems that had supported life in the hills for centuries. Villages that had thrived for generations began to empty as families fled to urban areas where safety might be found in numbers and modern amenities. Traditional crafts and agricultural techniques that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge were abandoned as practitioners left the region or died without passing on their expertise. The colonial administration recognized that the situation had moved beyond a simple wildlife management problem to become a threat to civil order and economic stability throughout a significant portion of northern India. Reports filed with superior authorities described a crisis that required immediate intervention to prevent complete social collapse in the affected region. The stage was being set for a final attempt to resolve the situation through methods that had not yet been tried. In April 1906, district officials in Nainital received a letter from a railway engineer named Edward James Corbett, offering his services in dealing with the Champawat man-eater. Corbett was known throughout the region as an experienced hunter who had successfully tracked several dangerous animals in previous years. More importantly, he possessed knowledge of forest conditions and animal behavior that had been acquired through decades of work in remote areas where few Europeans had ventured. Jim Corbett was 31 years old and had spent most of his adult life in the forests of Kumaon, first as a forest contractor and later as a railway engineer, responsible for construction projects that required detailed knowledge of terrain and wildlife patterns. His work had brought him into contact with local hunters and trackers whose traditional knowledge complemented his own observations of animal behavior. Unlike the British sportsmen who had attempted to hunt the tigress in previous years, Corbett understood that success would require patience, local knowledge, and respect for the intelligence of his quarry. The colonial authorities accepted his offer with some skepticism. Previous attempts by experienced hunters had failed despite elaborate preparations and substantial resources. The Tigress had proven herself capable of evading trained military personnel and professional hunting parties equipped with the most modern weapons available. There was little reason to expect that a single individual, regardless of his reputation, would succeed where organized efforts had failed. But Corbett's approach differed fundamentally from previous hunting attempts. Instead of organizing large parties with extensive equipment, he planned to work alone or with a single local tracker. Rather than attempting to force an encounter with the tigress, he intended to study her behavior until he understood her patterns well enough to predict her movements. Most importantly, he was prepared to spend whatever time was necessary to accomplish his goal, even if the pursuit lasted months or years. His first weeks in the region were devoted to gathering information from sources that had been ignored by previous hunters. He interviewed elderly villagers who possessed detailed knowledge about tiger behavior based on generations of living in close proximity to these predators. He consulted local priests and traditional healers who understood spiritual aspects of relationships between humans and dangerous animals. He spent time with forest guards and woodcutters whose daily work had given them intimate familiarity with terrain and wildlife patterns in the tigress's territory. From these conversations, Corbett began to construct a more complete picture of the man-eater's behavior than had been available to previous hunting parties. He learned that she followed certain routes through the forest with remarkable consistency, suggesting that she had established territorial patterns similar to those of normal tigers. She preferred certain types of terrain for hunting and avoided others for reasons that reflected both practical considerations and what seemed to be personal preferences developed over years of operating in the same area. More importantly, Corbett discovered that the tigress had specific behaviors that distinguished her from other tigers in ways that might provide opportunities for a hunter who understood them correctly. Witnesses reported that she often returned to kill sites several times, apparently to guard them against scavengers rather than to feed further. She showed unusual interest in human activities, sometimes watching villages for extended periods from concealed positions. She seemed to avoid certain areas and times that corresponded to patterns no previous hunter had recognized. Armed with this information, Corbett began systematic tracking that differed significantly from earlier hunting attempts. Instead of trying to follow fresh tracks in hopes of overtaking the tigress, he studied old tracks to understand her established routes and timing. He identified places where she regularly crossed streams or passed through gaps in ridgelines that channeled her movement in predictable directions. He located sites where she had rested repeatedly, suggesting that they might be favored spots where she could be found again under the right circumstances. The process was slow and required patience that had been lacking in previous hunting efforts. Corbett spent days following cold trails that provided information about the tigress's preferences and patterns even when they did not lead to direct encounters. He established observation points at locations where multiple game trails converged, positions that allowed him to watch for signs of her presence without exposing himself to the risk of being watched in return. Local villagers initially viewed his solitary methods with skepticism that reflected their experience with previous hunting failures. The systematic approach of military expeditions and large hunting parties had seemed more likely to succeed than the quiet techniques employed by a single individual who seemed to rely more on patience than on firepower. Some community leaders questioned whether he possessed sufficient understanding of the supernatural aspects of the tigress's behavior that had become central to local explanations for her invulnerability. But Corbett's approach gradually gained credibility as he demonstrated knowledge of forest conditions that exceeded anything shown by previous hunters. His ability to predict where fresh tracks would be found, based on his understanding of the tigress's established patterns, convinced local trackers that he possessed insights that might prove more valuable than the elaborate equipment and large numbers that had characterized earlier hunting attempts. More importantly, his respectful attitude toward traditional knowledge about relationships between humans and dangerous animals earned him cooperation from local sources who had remained silent during previous investigations. Elderly hunters who possessed decades of experience with tiger behavior began to share information they had withheld from colonial authorities whose dismissive attitudes toward local knowledge had made them reluctant partners in earlier hunting efforts. By June 1906, Corbett had developed a comprehensive understanding of the tigress's territory and behavior pattern. He had identified several locations where encounters might be possible under the right circumstances. He had established relationships with local trackers whose knowledge of terrain and wildlife would be essential for any successful hunting attempt. Most importantly, he had gained insight into the tigress's personality and intelligence that suggested specific strategies for bringing her within rifle range. His preparations included careful selection of weapons and equipment appropriate for the particular challenges posed by hunting this specific animal in this specific terrain. Previous hunters had relied on heavy rifles suitable for long-range shooting in open country, weapons that were poorly suited to the thick cover and close quarters that characterized most of the tigress's territory. Corbett chose lighter, more maneuverable firearms that could be aimed quickly in the dense undergrowth where any encounter was likely to occur. He also developed tactics based on his understanding of the tigress's behavior that differed from conventional hunting methods. Instead of trying to drive her toward waiting guns, he planned to position himself along routes she was known to use regularly. Rather than attempting to track her actively during her hunting periods, he intended to wait at locations where she might appear during her normal territorial movements. The psychological preparation for hunting the Champawat Tigress required recognition that he was dealing with an animal whose behavior exceeded normal tiger patterns in fundamental ways. Her intelligence, her hunting success, and her ability to evade capture suggested that conventional hunting techniques would be inadequate. Success would require understanding her specific personality and adapting tactics to match her individual characteristics, rather than relying on general knowledge about tiger behavior. By autumn of 1906, Corbett was ready to begin the final phase of his pursuit. He had spent 6 months studying his quarry and preparing for an encounter that might last only seconds, but would require every advantage he could gain through patient preparation. The stage was set for a confrontation between a man-eating tigress who had terrorized an entire region for 3 years and a hunter who had devoted more time and effort to understanding her behavior than anyone before him. October 1906 marked the beginning of Jim Corbett's systematic pursuit of the Champawat Tigress, a hunt that would test his endurance, skill, and understanding of tiger behavior over the following months. Unlike previous hunting efforts that had relied on large numbers of men and extensive equipment, Corbett's approach was methodical and patient, based on his growing knowledge of the tigress's habits and preferences. He established a base camp near the village of Champawat, choosing a location that provided access to multiple areas where the tigress was known to hunt regularly. The camp consisted of a simple tent and basic supplies, reflecting his belief that mobility and flexibility were more important than comfort or elaborate preparations. His only companion was a local tracker named Bag Singh, an elderly man whose knowledge of forest conditions and tiger behavior had been developed over decades of work as a guide for hunting parties. Bag Singh brought to the partnership traditional knowledge about tiger behavior that complemented Corbett's more systematic approach to tracking and hunting. He could read signs in disturbed vegetation and soil conditions that revealed not only where the tigress had passed, but when she had passed and what her behavior had been at the time. His understanding of how tigers moved through different types of terrain provided insights that proved crucial for predicting where encounters might be possible. The early weeks of the pursuit established patterns that would characterize the entire hunt. Each morning, Corbett and Bag Singh would examine areas where fresh tracks might indicate the tigress's recent activities. They followed trails not with the expectation of overtaking their quarry, but to understand her current behavior patterns and identify locations where she might be found under favorable circumstances. The tigress's tracks revealed behavior that confirmed many of Corbett's theories about her intelligence and adaptability. She used well-established routes through the forest, but varied her timing in ways that made prediction difficult. She showed clear preferences for certain types of terrain, favoring areas where thick cover provided concealment, but nearby clearings offered opportunities to observe potential prey. Most significantly, her tracks indicated that she was aware of being hunted and had modified her behavior accordingly. Evidence of this awareness appeared in various forms throughout the early stages of the pursuit. The tigress began using routes that were difficult to follow, choosing rocky terrain where tracks were hard to detect or stream beds where water would erase signs of her passage. She started making wide detours around areas where human activity had increased, suggesting that she could distinguish between normal village routines and the heightened activity associated with hunting parties. Most disturbing from a hunter's perspective, she seemed to be watching her pursuers as carefully as they were trying to watch her. Corbett found evidence that the tigress had observed his camp from concealed positions, apparently studying his equipment and daily routines. Fresh tracks appeared near areas where he had been hunting, but always after he had moved to other locations. The pattern suggested that she was learning about his methods and adapting her behavior to avoid encounters. November brought the first direct contact between Corbett and his quarry, though not in circumstances that either hunter or prey had anticipated. While following fresh tracks through dense forest near the village of Kaldhungi, Corbett became aware that he was being followed. His initial assumption was that another villager had joined the tracking party without his knowledge, but careful observation revealed that the sounds behind him did not match human movement patterns. The realization that the tigress was stalking him while he was attempting to stalk her created a psychological challenge that went beyond the normal stress of hunting dangerous game. Corbett found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, listening for sounds that might indicate the position of a predator who had proven herself more than capable of killing armed men. The mental strain of being simultaneously hunter and hunted began to affect his judgment and observation skills. Bog Singh's experience proved invaluable during this period of psychological pressure. The elderly tracker had dealt with dangerous animals throughout his career and understood the mental discipline required to function effectively when death might be seconds away. His calm demeanor and practical advice helped Corbett maintain the focus necessary for successful hunting, while adapting to the unique challenges posed by a quarry that was also an active threat. The tracking during November revealed that the tigress had established a complex territorial pattern that covered an area of approximately 40 square miles. She moved through this territory on a rough cycle that brought her back to specific locations every 8 to 12 days, though the timing varied enough to make precise prediction impossible. Her route included several villages where she continued to hunt humans, but also encompassed areas of pure forest where she pursued normal tiger prey. Understanding this territorial pattern allowed Corbett to develop a hunting strategy based on positioning rather than tracking. Instead of following the tigress's movements reactively, he began to anticipate her arrival at specific locations where terrain and timing might provide opportunities for a successful shot. This approach required patience and the willingness to spend long hours in concealment, but it offered better prospects than the active pursuit methods that had failed for previous hunters. December brought several near encounters that demonstrated both the possibilities and the risks of Corbett's new approach. The closest occurred at a waterhole near Champawat, where tracks indicated that the tigress drank regularly during her territorial rounds. Corbett positioned himself in thick cover downwind from the water source and waited through 3 consecutive nights for her to appear. On the third night, she arrived exactly as his analysis of her behavior patterns had predicted. But instead of approaching the water directly, she seemed to sense his presence and began a careful investigation of the area around his hiding place. For more than an hour, the tigress moved through the forest around him, apparently trying to locate the source of whatever had alarmed her instincts. Several times she passed within 20 yards of his position, but never in circumstances that provided a clear shot. The encounter ended when the tigress simply disappeared into the darkness, leaving Corbett with the unsettling realization that she had probably been aware of his presence from the moment she arrived at the waterhole. Her investigation had been methodical and thorough, demonstrating intelligence that exceeded anything he had previously observed in wild animals. The experience convinced him that success would require techniques specifically adapted to her individual behavior rather than general hunting methods. January 1907 marked a turning point in the pursuit, as Corbett began to understand aspects of the tigress's personality that had eluded previous hunters. She was not simply an intelligent animal, but an individual with specific preferences and habits that could be used to predict her behavior under certain circumstances. She showed particular interest in human activities, often positioning herself where she could observe villages without being seen. She had favorite resting places that she used repeatedly, locations that offered security and comfort that appealed to her personal preferences. Most importantly, Corbett realized that the tigress had become overconfident as a result of her prolonged success in evading hunters. Her caution was still evident, but it was now balanced by a sense of superiority that sometimes led her to take risks that a more frightened animal would have avoided. This overconfidence represented a potential weakness that could be exploited by a hunter who understood how to present himself as a target while maintaining tactical advantage. The insight came during a tracking session when Corbett found evidence that the tigress had spent several hours watching his camp from a position that would have exposed her to rifle fire if he had detected her presence. Her tracks indicated that she had arrived during daylight hours and remained in position well into the evening, apparently studying his routines and equipment with the curiosity of an animal that no longer feared immediate retaliation. This behavior suggested that the tigress viewed herself as the dominant predator in her territory, confident enough to investigate potential threats rather than simply avoiding them. The psychology behind such behavior opened possibilities for hunting strategies that relied on her curiosity and overconfidence rather than attempting to surprise an animal that had proven herself nearly impossible to ambush. By February 1907, Corbett had spent 4 months in almost daily contact with the tigress, without achieving a successful shot. But the extended pursuit had provided insights into her behavior that no previous hunter had possessed. He understood her territorial patterns, her individual preferences, and most importantly, the psychological factors that influenced her decision-making in specific situations. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would depend not on luck or superior firepower, but on Corbett's ability to use his accumulated knowledge to create circumstances that would bring the Champawat Tigress within rifle range under conditions that favored the hunter rather than the prey. March 1907 brought subtle changes in the tigress's behavior that suggested to Corbett that his months of patient pursuit were beginning to affect her normal routines. The signs were small but significant to someone who had studied her patterns with obsessive attention to detail. She began using secondary trails more frequently, avoiding main routes that had previously been her preferred pathways through the forest. Her timing became more irregular, with longer intervals between appearances at established landmarks. Most tellingly, her kills became more frequent and more widely scattered, suggesting that the constant pressure of being hunted was affecting her psychological state. Normal tigers killed every 4 to 6 days and fed from the same carcass for several meals. The Champawat Tigress was now killing every 2 to 3 days and abandoning kills after feeding only once, behavior that indicated stress levels that might eventually work in a hunter's favor. Corbett interpreted these changes as evidence that his strategy of patient pressure was succeeding in ways that more aggressive hunting methods had failed to achieve. The tigress was still supremely dangerous and apparently invulnerable to direct attack, but she was no longer completely comfortable in her own territory. The psychological balance that had favored her so heavily was beginning to shift toward more equal terms. The key insight that would ultimately lead to success came from Bog Singh, whose traditional knowledge provided understanding that complemented Corbett's more scientific approach to analyzing animal behavior. The elderly tracker pointed out that the tigress's recent kills had been concentrated in areas closer to human settlements, as if she was drawing comfort from proximity to the prey that had sustained her for 3 years. This observation led to a careful analysis of the relationship between kill sites and village locations that revealed a pattern no previous hunter had recognized. The tigress's hunting had evolved from opportunistic attacks on isolated individuals to systematic predation that followed predictable patterns related to human activity cycles. She had learned to anticipate when and where people would be most vulnerable, timing her hunts to coincide with daily routines that brought potential prey into areas where attacks were most likely to succeed. Understanding this pattern allowed Corbett to predict not only where the tigress might hunt, but when she would be in position to begin stalking prey. The knowledge created opportunities to intercept her before she began hunting, rather than attempting to track her after kills had already occurred. This approach offered tactical advantages that had been impossible to achieve through previous hunting methods. The first attempt to use this new understanding occurred in the 3rd week of March, when Corbett positioned himself along a route the tigress regularly used to approach villages during evening hours. The location he chose was a narrow ravine, where the terrain forced her to follow a specific path that would bring her within rifle range of his concealed position. The wait lasted nearly 8 hours, from late afternoon through the early hours of the night. Just after midnight, Corbett heard sounds that indicated the approach of a large animal moving with the careful deliberation that characterized the tigress's hunting behavior. But instead of appearing where his analysis had predicted, she emerged from thick cover on the opposite side of the ravine, positioning herself where she could observe his hiding place without exposing herself to rifle fire. For 20 minutes, hunter and prey watched each other across 40 yards of open ground. The tigress showed no signs of fear or agitation, studying Corbett with the same methodical attention she might have given to any other element of her territory that required evaluation. Her behavior confirmed his growing understanding that she viewed him as an interesting opponent rather than a serious threat to her continued dominance of the region. The encounter ended when the tigress simply turned and walked away, disappearing into forests so thick that following her became impossible within seconds. but the psychological impact of the confrontation was significant for both participants. Corbett realized that he was dealing with an animal whose confidence bordered on arrogance, a characteristic that might provide opportunities for someone who understood how to exploit overconfidence. The tigress had demonstrated that she was aware of his presence and capabilities, but was not sufficiently concerned to modify her behavior beyond minimal precautions. April brought the breakthrough that would ultimately lead to success. While examining kill sites in the vicinity of Champawat village, Corbett discovered evidence that the tigress had begun using a specific ravine as a regular resting place between hunting expeditions. The location offered everything she required: water from a small stream, thick cover that provided concealment, and a position that allowed her to observe approaches from multiple directions. More importantly, the ravine was accessible from only two directions, both of which could be watched simultaneously by a hunter positioned correctly. The terrain that made it attractive to the tigress as a resting place also made it a potential trap if she could be caught there under the right circumstances. Corbett spent several days studying the approaches to the ravine and determining how the tigress's movements could be predicted based on her established territorial patterns. She typically arrived at the resting place during daylight hours after completing hunting expeditions that began before dawn. Her approach route varied depending on where she had been hunting, but all possible paths converged at a single point where the ravine narrowed between granite boulders. The hunting strategy that emerged from this analysis was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Corbett would position himself where he could watch the convergence point while remaining concealed from the tigress's approach. He would wait for her to enter the ravine, then attempt to take his shot when she passed through the narrow area between the boulders where escape routes were limited. Success would depend on precise timing and accurate shooting under pressure that exceeded anything in Corbett's previous hunting experience. The tigress had proven herself capable of incredible speed and agility when threatened. Any shot that failed to kill or disable her immediately would likely result in a charge from an enraged predator whose capabilities were already legendary throughout the region. Preparation for the final hunt required attention to details that reflected the unique challenges posed by this specific quarry. Corbett selected ammunition designed for maximum stopping power at close range, accepting reduced accuracy at longer distances in favor of bullets that would create immediately incapacitating wounds. He practiced shooting from the cramped position he would need to maintain while concealed among the rocks overlooking the ravine. Most importantly, he rehearsed the mental preparation necessary to function effectively during seconds that would determine whether 3 years of terror would end or continue. The psychological pressure of facing the Champawat tigress in direct confrontation required discipline that went beyond normal hunting skills. Fear, excitement, and the weight of responsibility for protecting thousands of innocent people all had to be controlled long enough to achieve the precise shot placement that would be necessary for success. By late April, everything was ready. Corbett had identified the optimal position for his ambush, practiced the shooting techniques he would need, and prepared himself mentally for what might be his only opportunity to end the reign of terror that had traumatized an entire region. The weather was favorable, with clear skies that would provide good visibility and calm air that would not affect bullet trajectory. The final element was patience. The tigress's movements could be predicted in general terms, but her exact timing remained variable. She might arrive at the ravine on any day within a window of approximately a week, and there was no way to determine in advance when she would make her appearance. Corbett would need to maintain his vigil until she presented him with the opportunity he had spent months preparing to exploit. On the morning of the 23rd of April, 1907, Jim Corbett positioned himself in the concealed blind he had prepared, overlooking the narrow ravine, where the Champawat tigress regularly rested between hunting expeditions. The location offered everything he required for a successful ambush: clear fields of fire, natural concealment, and multiple escape routes if the encounter went badly. More importantly, it was the only place where months of patient study had suggested he might find the tigress in circumstances that favored the hunter rather than the prey. The morning was clear and windless, conditions that would provide optimal visibility and eliminate air currents that might affect bullet trajectory at the moment when precise shot placement would mean the difference between success and disaster. Corbett had chosen a position among granite boulders that allowed him to observe the entire approach to the ravine while remaining invisible to any animal moving along the established game trail. His rifle was a .275 Rigby, a weapon he had selected specifically for its balance of stopping power and accuracy at the ranges where any encounter with the tigress was likely to occur. The ammunition consisted of soft-point bullets designed to expand on impact and create wounds that would immediately disable even the largest predators. Everything that preparation could accomplish had been done. Success would now depend on the Tigress appearing at the predicted location and on Corbett's ability to make an accurate shot under pressure. The wait began before dawn and continued through the morning hours when the Tigress was most likely to arrive at her resting place. Corbett maintained absolute stillness, knowing that any movement might betray his presence to an animal whose senses had been sharpened by 3 years of evading hunters. The forest around him came alive with normal sounds of birds and small animals going about their daily routines, sounds that would change dramatically if a large predator entered the area. By noon, the psychological strain of waiting had begun to affect Corbett's concentration. The cramped position necessary for concealment was becoming physically uncomfortable, and the mental pressure of maintaining constant readiness for a shot that might never come was testing his disciplinary resources. But his months of studying the Tigress had taught him that patience was the most important weapon any hunter could possess when dealing with an animal of her intelligence and experience. The first indication of her approach came through changes in forest sounds rather than visual contact. Birds that had been calling normally throughout the morning suddenly fell silent in a pattern that moved through the forest like a wave. Small animals that had been visible feeding in clearings disappeared into whatever cover was available. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as the dominant predator in the region made her way toward her chosen resting place. Corbett heard her before he saw her, the sound of careful footsteps moving through thick undergrowth with the deliberate pace of an animal that feared nothing in its environment. The Tigress was approaching along one of the routes his analysis had predicted, following game trails that led directly toward the narrow passage between the granite boulders where he would have his best opportunity for a clear shot. When she finally came into view, the sight was more impressive than anything he had imagined during months of tracking and study. The Champawat Tigress was larger than any tiger he had previously encountered, with a magnificent coat marked by stripes that seemed almost black in the filtered sunlight. Her movements demonstrated the perfect coordination of a predator at the peak of her physical powers, each step placed with precision that made no unnecessary sound. But it was her demeanor more than her physical appearance that struck Corbett most forcefully. The Tigress moved through her territory with complete confidence, showing none of the caution that characterized normal tigers in areas where they might encounter humans. She paused occasionally to scan her surroundings, but the movement seemed routine rather than indicating any particular concern about potential threats. As she approached the narrow passage between the boulders, Corbett prepared for the shot that would end her reign of terror. The distance was approximately 60 yards, well within the range where his rifle would provide the accuracy necessary for precise bullet placement. The Tigress was moving slowly enough that leading her movement would not be difficult. Everything favored success except for the pressure of knowing that failure would likely result in his own death and the continuation of killings that had already claimed more than 200 lives. The Tigress entered the narrow passage exactly as Corbett's analysis had predicted, moving at a steady pace that would bring her past his position within seconds. He aligned his sights on a point just behind her left shoulder, where a bullet would penetrate vital organs and provide the immediate stopping power necessary to prevent a charge. His finger found the trigger and began the steady pressure that would release the shot that had been months in preparation. But at the moment when everything seemed perfect for a successful conclusion to the hunt, the Tigress did something that no previous study of her behavior had suggested was possible. She stopped directly in the center of the passage and turned to look straight at Corbett's hiding place, as if she had been aware of his presence from the moment she entered the ravine. For several seconds, that seemed to last for hours, hunter and prey stared at each other across the distance that separated them. The Tigress showed no signs of alarm or preparation for flight, studying Corbett with the same methodical attention she had shown during their previous encounters. Her expression seemed almost curious, as if she was trying to understand what had brought this particular human to challenge her dominance of territory she had controlled for 3 years. The psychological impact of her direct gaze was more unsettling than Corbett had expected. He had prepared himself for a shot at an animal moving through the forest, not for a confrontation with a predator whose intelligence seemed to transcend normal animal limitations. The weight of her attention made precise shooting more difficult than simple physical factors like distance and wind conditions. But the moment of mutual examination could not last indefinitely. The Tigress eventually shifted her attention away from Corbett's position and began to move again through the passage between the boulders. The opportunity he had spent months preparing for was still available, requiring only the disciplined execution of shooting skills he had practiced countless times. Corbett realigned his sights and completed the trigger pressure he had begun before the tigress noticed his presence. The rifle's report echoed off the granite walls of the ravine like thunder, followed immediately by sounds that indicated the bullet had found its target. The tigress stumbled and fell, then struggled to regain her feet before collapsing again in a position that suggested the wound had been immediately fatal. But Corbett remained in his concealed position for several minutes after the shot, knowing that wounded tigers were capable of incredible feats of strength and determination even when mortally injured. The Champawat Tigress had demonstrated supernatural capabilities throughout her career as a man-eater. He could not assume that a single bullet, regardless of how well placed, would be sufficient to end her life immediately. Only when it became clear that no movement was coming from the area where she had fallen did Corbett emerge from his hiding place and approach the body of the animal that had terrorized northern India for 3 years. Even in death, the tigress was magnificent, her size and physical condition suggesting an animal at the peak of her powers rather than the aged or disabled predator that typically became a man-eater. Examination of her teeth revealed the factor that had probably initiated her career of killing humans. Her upper and lower canine teeth on the right side had been broken, likely by a bullet from some previous encounter with hunters. The damage would have made killing normal prey extremely difficult, forcing her to seek easier targets that could be killed without the precise bite placement required for bringing down large wild animals. The discovery explained much about the tigress's behavior that had seemed inexplicable during the long months of pursuit. Her preference for human prey, her apparent fearlessness around people, and her incredible success as a man-eater all made sense when viewed as adaptations to physical limitations that had forced her to abandon normal tiger hunting methods. As word of the successful hunt spread through the region, villagers began to emerge from houses where they had lived in fear for 3 years. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, but tempered by recognition that the psychological scars left by the tigress's reign of terror would take much longer to heal than the few seconds required to end her life. News of the Champawat Tigress's death spread through the hill villages of Kumaon with remarkable speed, carried by runners who traveled forest paths that had been deserted for months. The reaction was immediate and profound, reflecting 3 years of accumulated fear that could finally be released. Families who had barricaded themselves behind locked doors each evening cautiously ventured outside to examine a world that no longer held the constant threat of death. In Champawat village, the first confirmation came when Corbett arrived carrying evidence of his successful hunt. The crowd that gathered around him represented the entire population of a community that had been decimated by the tigress's presence. Men who had not walked alone through the forest in years stood in small groups discussing plans for returning to fields that had been abandoned when farming became too dangerous. Women talked about resuming daily routines that had been interrupted by the need for constant vigilance. Children, who had spent their formative years living under the shadow of the man-eater, reacted with confusion that reflected their limited understanding of a world without constant danger. For them, fear of the tigress had been a normal part of daily life, as natural as awareness of weather or seasonal changes. The sudden absence of this threat created a psychological void that would take time to fill with more normal childhood experiences. The British colonial administration received official notification of the hunt's success with relief that extended far beyond the immediate region where the killings had occurred. District officers who had filed increasingly desperate reports about social breakdown and economic disruption could finally document resolution of a crisis that had challenged their authority and competence for 3 years. Military commanders who had been unable to protect civilian populations despite substantial resources and manpower were vindicated by the success of methods that relied on individual skill rather than organized force. Local government officials began the process of assessing damage caused by 3 years of disrupted normal life. Agricultural production had declined dramatically as farmers abandoned fields that were too isolated to work safely. Trade relationships that had connected hill villages with plains markets had been severed when merchants refused to risk travel through areas where the tigress might be hunting. Traditional crafts and industries had suffered as artisans fled the region or died without passing on their expertise to younger generations. The economic consequences extended beyond simple matters of lost income and disrupted commerce. Systems of credit and exchange that had evolved over generations had broken down under the pressure of constant uncertainty about survival. Property values had collapsed as families abandoned homes and land that represented decades of investment. Traditional knowledge about farming techniques, forest management, and wildlife patterns had been lost when practitioners died or left the region. Religious institutions had been profoundly affected by the crisis and its resolution. Temples that had been centers of community life for centuries had seen their influence diminish as people sought spiritual protection through individual rituals rather than communal ceremonies. Traditional festivals and observances had been canceled or drastically modified to reduce the risk of attracting the tigress's attention. The authority of priests and religious leaders had been challenged by their inability to provide effective protection against a threat that seemed beyond spiritual intervention. The successful hunt created its own religious interpretations that reflected local understanding of how spiritual and material worlds intersected in daily life. Some villagers viewed Corbett's success as evidence that divine forces had finally chosen to intervene on behalf of human communities that had suffered enough punishment for whatever sins had brought the tigress into their lives. Others interpreted the outcome as proof that traditional protective rituals had eventually succeeded in neutralizing supernatural threats. These spiritual explanations for the tigress's death were important for psychological healing that would be necessary before normal life could resume in the affected communities. People who had lived in terror for 3 years needed to understand not only that the immediate threat was gone, but why it had appeared in the first place and what had caused it to end. Religious frameworks provided answers to these questions that scientific explanations of animal behavior could not address. But the most profound impact of the successful hunt was on individual families who had lost members to the tigress during her 3 years of killing. For them, news of her death brought closure to grief that had been complicated by the knowledge that their loved one's killer remained alive and free to claim additional victims. The end of the terror meant that mourning could finally become a private matter rather than part of a community-wide trauma that affected everyone. Medical consequences of the crisis had been severe throughout the affected region. Traditional healers reported dramatic increases in anxiety-related disorders, sleep disturbances, and stress-related illnesses that reflected the psychological toll of living under constant threat. Pregnant women had suffered complications at increased rates, and infant mortality had risen in villages where normal patterns of prenatal care had been disrupted by restrictions on movement. Recovery from these health impacts would require time and resources that were not immediately available to communities whose economic foundations had been severely damaged. Many families had exhausted their savings during years when normal income-producing activities had become impossible. Traditional support systems that might have helped people recover from trauma had been weakened by displacement and social disruption. The tigress's death also marked the beginning of efforts to understand the biological and ecological factors that had contributed to her exceptional behavior as a man-eater. Examination of her body revealed the dental damage that had probably initiated her career of killing humans, but questions remained about other factors that had enabled her to succeed where most injured tigers would have died of starvation. Her physical condition at the time of death suggested an animal at the peak of her powers rather than the disabled predator that typically became a man-eater. Her weight and muscle development indicated that she had been feeding well throughout her career of human predation. Her coat condition showed none of the deterioration that might be expected in a tiger struggling to survive with damaged teeth. These observations led to recognition that the Champawat Tigress represented something more complex than simple injury-induced man-eating behavior. She had not only adapted to physical limitations that should have been fatal, but had actually thrived while doing so. Her success suggested learning abilities and behavioral flexibility that exceeded normal tiger capabilities by substantial margins. The implications of these discoveries extended beyond academic interest in tiger behavior. If one tiger could learn to hunt humans so effectively that she killed more than 400 people over 3 years, others might possess similar potential under certain circumstances. Understanding the factors that had created the Champawat tigress became important for preventing similar tragedies in the future. Forest officials began reviewing policies and practices that might have contributed to the development of her man-eating behavior. Traditional hunting regulations were examined to determine whether changes in prey populations had forced tigers to seek alternative food sources. Patterns of human settlement and land use were analyzed to identify activities that might increase the likelihood of dangerous encounters between people and large predators. These investigations revealed complex relationships between human activities and wildlife behavior that had not been adequately understood by previous management approaches. The expansion of agriculture into previously forested areas had reduced prey populations while simultaneously increasing contact between tigers and humans. Changes in traditional hunting practices had disrupted ecological balances that had maintained relatively stable relationships between people and dangerous animals for centuries. The lessons learned from the Champawat Tigress case would influence wildlife management policies throughout the British Empire and beyond. Her exceptional behavior demonstrated that traditional approaches to dealing with problem animals were inadequate when dealing with predators whose intelligence and adaptability exceeded normal expectations. The success of Corbett's patient, methodical hunting approach suggested that understanding individual animal behavior was more important than applying general techniques based on species-typical patterns. Most importantly, the case established the reputation of Jim Corbett as a hunter whose methods differed fundamentally from conventional approaches to dangerous game. His success in tracking and killing the most notorious man-eater in recorded history would lead to requests for his assistance with similar problems throughout India and beyond. The techniques he had developed during months of pursuing the Champawat Tigress would become the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting human communities from dangerous wildlife. The death of the Champawat Tigress marked more than the end of a single animal's reign of terror. It represented the conclusion of an era when large predators could dominate vast territories and shape human behavior across entire regions through force alone. The systematic methods that had finally succeeded in tracking and killing her demonstrated that human intelligence and persistence, properly applied, could overcome even the most formidable natural opponents. In the immediate aftermath of the successful hunt, life in the affected villages began to return to patterns that had been abandoned 3 years earlier. Women resumed solitary trips to collect water and firewood from forest sources that had been too dangerous to visit during the tigress's lifetime. Men returned to fields that had been left unharvested when agricultural work became impossible due to the constant threat of attack. Children began to play in areas that had been forbidden territory since they were old enough to understand the danger. But the psychological recovery was more gradual than the simple resumption of practical activities. People who had lived in constant fear for 3 years did not immediately trust that the threat was truly gone. Many families continued to bar their doors at night and travel in groups during daylight hours, habits that had become so deeply ingrained that abandoning them felt dangerous, even when rational analysis suggested they were no longer necessary. The economic recovery required even more time and effort. Agricultural production had declined to subsistence levels in many areas, and restoring productivity would require investment in equipment and livestock that had been lost or abandoned during the crisis. Trade relationships that had been severed when merchants refused to travel through dangerous territory needed to be re-established with partners who had found alternative sources and markets during the 3-year disruption. Traditional crafts and industries that had been interrupted by the crisis faced particular challenges in recovery. Master craftsmen who had fled the region or died during the terror had taken irreplaceable knowledge and skills with them. Apprenticeship systems that had transmitted specialized techniques across generations had been broken, creating gaps in local expertise that would take years to fill through retraining and recruitment from other areas. The social structure of affected communities had been permanently altered by the experience of living under constant threat. Leadership patterns had changed as traditional authorities proved unable to provide effective protection against the tigress. Religious practices had evolved in response to a crisis that challenged conventional understanding of relationships between spiritual and material worlds. Family structures had been modified by death, displacement, and adaptation to survival requirements that had not been anticipated by traditional social arrangements. These changes would have lasting effects on how hill communities understood their relationship with the natural world around them. The experience of being terrorized by a single animal for 3 years had demonstrated their vulnerability in ways that previous generations had not needed to confront. Traditional confidence in human dominance over wildlife had been shaken by evidence that exceptional predators could reverse normal power relationships and force humans to modify their behavior rather than simply displacing or eliminating problematic animals. The colonial administration used the successful resolution of the crisis to justify policies and approaches that had been criticized during the 3 years when conventional methods failed to stop the killings. Official reports emphasized the eventual success of British hunting techniques and equipment, minimizing the role of local knowledge and traditional tracking methods that had been crucial to Corbett's ultimate success. But the reality was more complex than colonial authorities were willing to acknowledge. The failure of military expeditions and organized hunting parties had demonstrated the limitations of conventional approaches when dealing with exceptional wildlife problems. The success of a single hunter working with local trackers and traditional knowledge had proven that understanding individual animal behavior was more important than superior firepower or numerical advantage. These lessons would influence how dangerous animal problems were addressed throughout the British Empire and beyond. The Champawat case established principles of patient study, careful observation, and respect for local expertise that would become standard elements of professional wildlife management. The systematic methods developed during the pursuit of the tigress would be applied to similar problems involving man-eating leopards, rogues, elephants, and other dangerous animals whose behavior exceeded normal species patterns. Jim Corbett's reputation was permanently established by his success in tracking and killing the most notorious man-eater in recorded history. Requests for his assistance with similar problems would come from throughout India and beyond, leading to a career that would make him one of the most famous hunters of the 20th century. But perhaps more importantly, his methods would evolve toward conservation and protection of wildlife rather than simply elimination of problem animals. The experience of hunting the Champawat tigress had taught Corbett that exceptional behavior in dangerous animals was usually the result of specific circumstances rather than inherent viciousness. The discovery of dental damage that had probably initiated her man-eating career led to understanding that most such cases involved animals that had been forced to abandon normal prey by injury, old age, or environmental changes that made traditional hunting methods impossible. This insight would shape his future approach to dangerous animal problems, emphasizing prevention of conditions that created man-eaters rather than simply responding to problems after they had developed. His later work would focus on habitat protection, prey conservation, and management of human-wildlife conflicts in ways that reduce the likelihood of dangerous encounters, rather than relying on elimination of problematic animals after people had already died. The Champawat tigress case also established precedents for how exceptional wildlife behavior should be documented and studied. The detailed records kept during the 3-year crisis provided the first systematic analysis of man-eating behavior that had ever been compiled. These records would become reference material for wildlife managers dealing with similar problems in other regions and time periods. The scientific value of this documentation extended beyond immediate practical applications to dangerous animal management. The case provided insights into tiger behavior, hunting techniques, and adaptability that enhanced understanding of how large predators function in environments where they come into contact with human populations. The psychological and social impacts of the crisis offered lessons about how communities respond to extended periods of threat from wildlife sources. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Champawat tigress was the demonstration that even the most exceptional wildlife problems could be resolved through the application of appropriate knowledge and techniques. Her 3-year reign of terror had seemed to many observers to represent a situation beyond human capability to address. The successful conclusion of the hunt proved that patient study and systematic approach could overcome any wildlife challenge, regardless of how formidable it might appear. This lesson would provide hope and guidance for future generations of wildlife managers dealing with problems that seemed impossible to solve through conventional methods. The precedent established by Corbett's success would encourage continued efforts to find solutions, even when initial attempts failed and when the scale of problems seemed overwhelming. The story of the Champawat tigress thus became more than a historical account of one man's successful hunt for a dangerous animal. It became a symbol of human capability to overcome natural challenges through intelligence, persistence, and respect for the complexity of relationships between people and wildlife. The methods developed during the pursuit would influence wildlife management practices for generations, and the successful outcome would provide inspiration for anyone facing problems that seemed beyond human capability to solve. In the end, the Champawat tigress was remembered, not only for the terror she had caused, but for the lessons her life and death had provided about the potential for human understanding to triumph over even the most formidable natural opponents. Her legacy would live on in the improved methods used to address human-wildlife conflicts, and in the recognition that every problem, regardless of how exceptional, could be solved through the proper application of knowledge, skill, and patient determination.